This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Andrew Peach, and in the early hours of Tuesday, the 13th of August, these are our main stories. The Trump administration announces new plans to target legal immigrants using benefits. Officials in Kashmir say the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha was celebrated peacefully despite reports that Srinagar remains in lockdown. And hundreds of pro-democracy demonstrators who'd been occupying Hong Kong airport overnight have now left as the authorities try to resume services. Also in this podcast,
it's a love story, really, at its centre, but it's kind of in a framework of two things I'm obsessed by. One is theatre and the other is politics.
A new play exploring the first ever African-American Othello. Let's begin in the United States, where the government is to penalise legal immigrants who rely on public assistance programs such as food stamps, medical care and housing vouchers as part of a drive to curb immigration. The new public charge rule will come into force in mid-October and target those who've been reliant for more than a year on public benefits. President Trump's administration will make it harder for such people to extend their visas or gain permanent residency. The acting director of the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ken Cuccinelli, has been speaking at the White House about this new regulation.
The benefit to taxpayers is a long-term benefit of seeking to ensure that our immigration system is bringing people to join us as American citizens, as legal permanent residents first, who can stand on their own 2 feet, who will not be reliant on the welfare system, especially in the age of the modern welfare state, which is so expansive and expensive, frankly.
The executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition, Steve Choi, has pledged to challenge the policy.
It's a very intentional effort by the Trump administration to continue to target immigrant communities with cruelty and with fear. We are going to fight back with all of our allies and our champions. We're going to fight back in the halls of Congress. We are going to fight back in the courts, and we're going to fight back in the streets as well.
Well, for more on this new policy, I've been speaking to our correspondent Peter Bowes in Los Angeles.
We're getting some detail, and it's very clear that it will make it much more difficult for poorer legal migrants to extend their visas or get what's known as a green card permanent resident status. Specifically, migrants who've been relying on public benefits like food aid or public housing for more than a year will be targeted. And if the government decides that they are likely to rely on public assistance in the future, those applications will be rejected. And the White House says to protect benefits for American citizens, immigrants must be financially self-sufficient. And it points out that 2/3 of immigrants entering the US do so based on family ties rather than on skill or merit.
Do we know how many people this will affect, or indeed how many people the administration hope it will affect?
Well, there's an estimated 22 million legal residents in the US that don't have citizenship, and many of those people are likely to be affected. The rule will go into effect in 60 days. Applicants for visa extensions, green cards, US citizenship will be subject to these more stringent regulations, and those who don't meet income standards or who are deemed likely to rely on benefits like Medicaid is another one, which is the government-run healthcare system, or housing vouchers, they may be blocked from entering the country in future. Immigrants who are already permanent residents here are unlikely to be affected by this rule change.
And just give me a little bit more on the early reaction to this announcement in the past couple of hours.
Well, there's been really swift political reaction. The Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris has tweeted that this, in her view, this latest crackdown on immigration is part of President Trump's ongoing campaign to vilify a whole group of people. She says it's indefensible. No family, she says, should live in fear of feeding, housing or caring for their kids. Response from civil rights groups has been along similar lines, saying that this will unfairly target low-income migrants. The National Immigration Law Center has said that it will sue the Trump administration to stop the regulation from taking effect.
Peter Bowes with me from Los Angeles. Next to Hong Kong, where there have been 10 successive weekends of protest against Beijing. Hundreds of pro-democracy demonstrators who'd been occupying Hong Kong airport overnight have now left. Aviation authorities are working to resume flights in the coming hours. All passenger flights from the airport were cancelled on Monday. It's now been cleared of the protesters. But the authorities in mainland China have nothing but praise for the police, while they say the protesters are showing signs of terrorism. Yang Guang is a spokesman for the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council.
For 2 months now, the Hong Kong police have been doing their duty according to the law. On the front line of stopping the violence and chaos, they have showed professionalism, restraint, and made an important contribution for all to see. In doing so, they have gained universal praise and utmost respect from all of those who want a peaceful society. In recent days, however, Hong Kong's radical demonstrators have repeatedly attacked police officers with extremely dangerous tools. They have always constituted serious violent crimes and have begun to show signs of terrorism.
Our correspondent Jonathan Head is at the airport and spoke to my colleague Julian Marshall.
There are an awful lot of stranded passengers. This was all very sudden, this decision to shut the airport. To be honest, we're not quite sure why the Hong Kong authorities did it. The protesters had built up numbers today. They've been here since last Friday, to the point where they were absolutely packing out the arrivals hall, but it was still functioning. Anyway, the authorities suddenly shut the airport down. This is one of the busiest airports in Asia. It's an absolutely massive hub, so the disruption is enormous. There are passengers snoozing behind the check-in desks, and we honestly thought that the police would at some point come in, and although it would have been very messy if they had with all these passengers, and cleared it out. In fact, photographs of riot police arriving have been circulating. The protesters had stayed here singing songs. They looked like they were going to hold on, and then they had a meeting and decided it wasn't worth a confrontation. And just in the last hour, they have just vanished. All I'm surrounded by now is airport officials coming back, pulling down all these very colourful and quite creative posters that the protesters have smothered the whole airport with, describing their struggle for, they say, for Hong Kong's democracy. They're all being pulled down. They're hoping, I think, to get this airport restarted by early morning. But, of course, there will be disruptions to flights, I would imagine, for several days because of the number that have been cancelled.
Meanwhile, Jonathan, the warnings coming from the mainland sounding more and more ominous.
Very strong language from China. Now, we don't know what to read into that. There have been fears and rumours that China would overtly intervene, bring in security forces to stop this rebellion as they see it. For many weeks now, it hasn't happened. There would be an enormous cost to China to be seen to be intervening itself and effectively ending Hong Kong's autonomy. But, you know, we're hearing the Chinese officials today describing the protests as being like terrorism. They're using language like extreme atrocities. It's a bit strong. I mean, when you think they were referring to petrol bombs, only 2 petrol bombs were thrown in all of yesterday's protests, in which the police dealt out a great deal of many beatings and a lot of injuries to protesters. So to call them terrorists is really outlandish. But, of course, it preps a Chinese public who are being conditioned by Chinese state media to see these Hong Kong demonstrators as unlawful rioters, bringing the entire territory into disrepute, damaging its economy. I think that's where the message is aimed at. It's aimed primarily at the Chinese public. But when you hear words like that, with them saying they need to respond with an iron fist, that Hong Kong is falling into the abyss, it does keep open that possibility that at some point we will see Chinese security forces here in Hong Kong.
Our correspondent Jonathan Head, who's at the Hong Kong airport. Now, Chloe Tilley has been talking to one of the protesters there at the airport, who asked to remain anonymous.
I've been protesting since when the extradition bill starting becoming an issue, but I came here because of it's more of a expression of an anger because the police shoot rubber bullets. No, I think it's bin bullets to a girl who's doing a first aid, in the protests in Tsim Sha Tsui, and I think she's completely blind at the moment because of the police brutality. So I think a lot of people like me who just came here to protest as an expression of our anger towards this police brutality.
What is it that you want to happen, and then you will stop protesting? For example, the extradition bill has been suspended, hasn't it?
Apparently, all protesters are saying the government has to fulfil the 5 demands. The first thing is to withdraw the bill completely, to set up an investigative committee to investigate, what's happening on the 12th of June when they shoot tear gas, and also what happened on the 12th of July in Yunlong when the trail members wearing all these white t-shirts beating up civilians. Carrie Lam has to step down, and also we want a real and genuine democracy, which is universal suffrage. We can elect our own chief executive and also all of our parliament members.
That's one of the protesters at Hong Kong Airport talking to my colleague Chloe Tilley. Now, tracked by wolves and menaced by bears, Ash Dykes from North Wales has become the first person to walk the whole length of the Yangtze River in China. He finished the epic journey in Shanghai on Monday, 1 year and 6,000 kilometres on from his starting point at the source of the river on the Tibetan Plateau. Janet Barry told me more.
The Yangtze is the third longest river in the world after the Nile and the Amazon, so it was a real feat. He said he wanted to raise awareness about environmental issues in China, but this was a really risky endeavour, delayed by extreme conditions and a typhoon and other hair-raising dangers in between.
I was followed by a pack of wolves for 2 days. Only the day after they had killed a local lady, unfortunately. There was bears. We were advised against trekking at night time, and of course trekking in numbers, because the bears were now coming off the mountain because it was getting too cold for them at the peaks, and they were now looking for extra calories before they went into hibernation.
It's enough to put me off, but this guy's got form in taking on challenges like this.
He certainly does. This is Ash Dykes' third big world achievement. In 2014, he trekked solo across Mongolia, and a year later, he hiked the length of Madagascar, which nearly killed him when he caught malaria.
Janet Barry reporting. The play 8 Hotels charts racial, political and personal histories in America across a dozen years through the 8 hotel rooms of the title. It's about a production of Shakespeare's Othello, which in 1944 toured America. And for the first time, the character Othello was played in the USA by an African-American, Paul Robeson. This production has just opened in Chichester, near London. Our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd went to see it.
A surprise hit on Broadway in 1944 was Othello. There were 296 performances, even today, the longest Shakespearean run on Broadway. Columbia recorded an original cast album with Paul Robeson in the title part and Josie Farrar as his nemesis, Iago.
Men are men. The best sometimes forget.
Thy honesty and love doth mince this matter, making it light to Cassio.
Desdemona on Broadway and on the 45-city national tour which followed was Farrar's then-wife, Uta Hagen. She and Robeson began a passionate affair, which is part of Nicholas Wright's new play.
It's a love story, really, at its centre, but it's kind of in a framework of two things I'm obsessed by. One is theatre and the other is politics. It starts in 1944 and it ends during the McCarthy period in the 1950s in the United States.
The director is Richard Eyre.
Paul Robeson was a political activist. Racial politics and anti-lynching demonstrations and demonstrations on behalf of civil rights, woven in with what authority, what identity means, which is a very topical subject.
No more pint of salt for me.
Paul Robeson had first visited the USSR in 1934. He believed he'd found a society where everyone was equal, regardless of race. His pro-Soviet opinions were just about tolerated in America in World War II, but for most of the 50s he was deprived of his passport by the State Department. Robeson is played in Chichester by American actor Tory Kittles.
First time he went to Russia, he says that was the first time he felt like a full human being. And so I think it was hard for him to get away from the politics of it all once you've been treated like that and you feel this way about something. He never denounced it. They took his passport away from him, and which crippled his means of earning. He was a guy who went from $100,000 a year to $6,000 a year because he was traveling all around the world.
Will you raise your right hand, please? You do solemnly swear in the matter now pending before this committee you'll tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
This is him in May 1948 before a Senate committee during hearings into the Subversive Activities Control Act proposed by Karl Mundt and Richard Nixon.
Are you an American communist?
That question has become the very basis of the struggle for American civil liberties. I refuse to answer the question.
Have you tried to make your Paul sound like the Paul?
Paul Robeson's voice is very well known to people of our age. If you're younger than 50, you won't have heard Paul Robeson. You may know of him as a great civil rights activist, but I don't think you'd be worried if he wasn't speaking with a very deep voice.
The actor Tori Kittles talking to our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd. Still to come in this podcast.
I ran with my brother, and in my excitement, I ran into a lamppost.
The little boy who broke his nose to meet his idol. Large mosques in Indian-administered Kashmir have been closed on the second day of the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha to deter protests against New Delhi's controversial decision to revoke the region's special status. Security forces in the main city Srinagar used checkpoints to restrict movement and contain any demonstrations outside smaller local mosques that were allowed to open. Our correspondent Yogita Limai is in Srinagar.
After they said their Eid prayers, hundreds took to the streets in a part of the city. They were protesting against the national government's decision to remove Indian-administered Kashmir's special status. There has been fierce opposition to the move, which was announced last week. But severe restrictions on the ground mean few people have been able to voice their dissent. In most parts of Srinagar, there was an uneasy quiet. The curfew, which had been eased in the run-up to the festival, was once again strictly enforced. Troops were out in strength, and there were checkpoints on nearly every road. Helicopters and drones were used to watch for any signs of unrest from the air. Big mosques were closed. People were allowed to pray in smaller numbers, but not everywhere. At one street junction, a group of men on their way to a local mosque was stopped. Standing behind a makeshift barbed wire fence, they shouted in anger. This is injustice. They're not allowing us to pray, one man said. For more than a week now, internet and phone lines have been cut off. It's unclear when the restrictions will be lifted. In a region that is no stranger to conflict, the Indian government is taking no chances.
Yogita Limai in Srinagar. The sudden death of the well-connected American billionaire Jeffrey Epstein has been dominating social media since he was found dead in a prison cell while facing sex trafficking charges on Saturday. Hashtag Epstein murder was trending all over the weekend. Prison officials say he took his own life, but internet conspiracy theorists have been quick to get to work. Gareth Evans told my colleague Chloe Tilley more about these.
Jeffrey Epstein is a man who's always been the subject of conspiracy theories, largely because of his connections to high-powered people. He has long-standing connections to Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, the Duke of York in the UK, and that's always kind of been fertile ground for conspiracy theorists to wonder, why does this man, a kind of hedge fund manager, billionaire, have these high-powered connections? And he's always been the subject of conspiracy theories. So when he died, it took minutes, maybe hours, until these conspiracy theories began to surface under the hashtag Epstein murder, the main theory being at the start that he was killed. Now, there's no evidence for this whatsoever. But, of course, on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, these conspiracy theories popped up and really gained traction, shared thousands of times throughout the day on Saturday. And there really was no stopping the spread of these.
As you say, not proven, but give us a sense of the sort of things people were suggesting.
Well, some of the theories that were being shared, were that this was an orchestrated hit job of Epstein, that somebody somewhere had wanted to silence him. Now, as I say, no evidence for this, but linking back to his high-powered connections, this is what it was all coming down to. Did somebody want Epstein dead? There's no evidence for this. That was the gist of many of the theories. Various other conspiracy theories were about why he was placed on suicide watch and why, according to the latest reports, he was removed from it. Now, it started that the conspiracy theories were, well, Epstein was on suicide watch. How on earth could he have managed to apparently kill himself? Then when it came out that he had been removed from suicide watch, those theories then morphed somewhat to, well, why wasn't he being monitored and why was he taken off?
And I guess this is just the nature of the time in which we live, isn't it? With social media, it's so easy for people to speculate. In years gone by, that would never have happened because there wasn't the access to share those ideas, and then it snowballed.
Of course, they snowballed and social media was a big part of that. But a big thing to consider as well is who was sharing these conspiracy theories. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, he retweeted one of these conspiracy theories suggesting that Bill Clinton somehow was involved in the death of Jeffrey Epstein. There's no evidence for this, but when the president of the country in which this happened is sharing these kind of theories, it only adds fuel to the fire, really, and this speculation rolled on and on throughout Saturday while politicians, journalists were adding their own thoughts about what may have happened. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, he said it was way too convenient that Jeffrey Epstein was now not able to implicate other people in the allegations surrounding him.
Gareth Evans on conspiracy theories surrounding the death of Jeffrey Epstein. Rwanda tea seems to be gaining the attention of buyers in East Africa's main tea auction in the Kenyan port city of Mombasa. Michael Kaloki has more.
Prices for Rwandan tea have been on the rise in recent months. Last week saw tea from a Rwandan factory attain the highest bid at the regional auction in the Kenyan port of Mombasa, attracting just over $5 per kilogram. Traditionally, Kenyan tea has attracted top bids at the auction, but analysts say international buyers have recently been keenly focused on tea quality. Kenya is the world's largest exporter of tea, and 3/4 of the produce that passes through the Mombasa auction is from the country. However, over the past few years, Rwanda has been keen to improve its tea quality for the export market. But there have been concerns raised by farmers in Rwanda about lower than expected tea production. In different seasons and over the course of several years, many plantations have been hit by both drought and floods.
Michael Kaloki reporting. Many superfans go to extreme lengths to try to meet their heroes, travelling around the world or messaging them every day on social media. One 11-year-old boy in the UK, Lewis Fowler, who's a big fan of Liverpool Football Club, broke his nose trying to get the attention of his hero, the Egyptian national and Liverpool forward Mo Salah. He told the BBC his story.
I ran with my brother, and in my excitement, I wasn't focusing on what was in front of me. I was obviously looking to the left because that was where Mo Salah's car was. Then obviously I ran into a lamppost. I think that Mo Salah felt bad and he pulled over. I think he was worried about me. And then Mo Salah just came driving with his car to our close, and Mo Salah checked if I was okay. He was really worried about me, and then we got pictures and it was great, but it was also not the best because of my nose.
11-year-old Lewis Fowler. Staying with faces, facial recognition technology may be widely used in China. Now it's moved into a new space, King's Cross in central London, and it's sparking concern.
Well, I think it's an intrusion. If they perfect it, it could be okay for making people safer, but at the moment I'm not quite sure. It's a bit of an infringement on my rights, really. I don't want people to know where I am all the time.
Our technology correspondent Zoe Kleinman told me more.
What they have said is that it's for the purposes of ensuring public safety. They say they're no different to other areas like shopping centres, sports centres. We're used to cameras being everywhere, and they are put there with the express purpose of security and safety, and that's what they say they're doing.
Is it allowed?
This is a really complicated area to get into. Under European data protection law, you have to have a very good reason for doing it. You have to have a legal basis, and you have to be able to demonstrate that this is actually something that is going to be of considerable benefit, if you like, to the public security. In terms of the law, facial recognition technology is not recognised in the same way as, for example, biometrics, that sort of fingerprints and iris scans and that that sort of thing. So it falls into a bit more of a grey area there.
And what are the concerns about how it could be abused from people who are worried about this?
People have so many issues around facial recognition tools. The fact is it's scanning your face. What's happening with that scan? Is the data being stored? Are you going to become part of a database somewhere else? Are you being compared to a list of individuals that they are looking to identify? And if you happen to look a bit like someone on that list, what are the future implications for you, not least being promptly arrested? And also there's just the issue of consent. Nobody walking about in King's Cross has explicitly consented to this.
Our tech reporter Zoe Kleiman with me. And that's all from us for now. There will be an updated version of Global News to download later. But if you'd like to comment on this edition and the stories we included, do drop us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. My name's Andrew Peach. Thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.